Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the George S. and Dolores Doré Eccles Foundation and the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report, Utah's legislature moves closer to a special session, and Democrats propose their own plans for tax reform. As the details of the plans emerge, constituents and community activists weigh in. And with the Judiciary Committee taking up the inquiry, Utah's leaders prepare for the next stage of the impeachment inquiry.
Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Representative Bryan King, House Minority Leader, Kate Bradshaw, Bountiful City Councilwoman, and Bryan Schott, Managing Editor of UtahPolicy.com. So glad to have you all with us today. We have a lot to talk about. We're going to start with you, Representative, though. On the program last week, we had a chance to hear from Republican leadership about their tax reform plan. This week we have the Democrats. Right. You have put out a plan. We want to talk about that and start talking about the two plans as we put them together. Tell us what the heart is of the Democrats' plan.
Well, there are a couple of components that are the heart of the plan. The first is that we agree that there are a lot of working Utahns and non-working Utahns, retirees, who could use a tax cut, and they're struggling to make ends meet. So we are willing to agree that the tax cut that's proposed by the Republican Party, the leadership in the House and the Senate, for the first $150,000 of a person's income is available. So there'll be a tax reduction there. And then for individuals making from $150,000 to $250,000, we have an incremental tax increase up to 6% on their marginal rates. From $250,000 to $600,000, it's an increase up to 7%. And for people making more than $600,000 a year, the marginal tax rate would be 8%. The purpose behind that is we feel, contrary to our Republican colleagues, that we should not be cutting revenue for public education and higher education. We need to give more resources for those things. And yet the people who are in the best position to help us with that, to step up to the plate and contribute a little more, are those who have done really well in the past few years and those who are doing well right now. Mm-hmm. So that's a fundamental part of our income tax proposal, is to basically reintroduce progressivity to our income tax structure in the state of Utah.
Okay, explain what that means.
Well, what it means is those who are doing well pay a little more in marginal income tax for the additional high dollar amounts that they make than those who are on the lower end of the income tax scale. It's fair, basically, is what it is. And this is something that we have in the federal tax system. It's something that most tax policy individuals feel is a good idea, and we agree with that. The second thing that we're doing that's new and different is, instead of taking a sales tax system that we have in the state of Utah that is basically a Swiss cheese amalgam of some have to pay it and some don't, and our economic activities have moved into more and more areas that don't pay it at all, such as services. Instead of trying to do that or trying to reform that or add to it, we believe that the better way to lower the rate and broaden the base, which is an appropriate tax policy objective when you're talking about economic services, is to put in place a gross receipts tax, mm-hmm. which means that every business in the state of Utah will pay a relatively small amount of their gross revenue in taxes. Our rate is 0.9%, less than 1%. And for me, as a small business owner, and I have my own law firm, this is going to be a new tax. It's going to be more money than I've ever paid in the past for that particular thing. I'm okay with that, though, because it's good tax policy, number one. And number two, it's going to result in most people in the state of Utah, probably 90% of them, paying less in taxes because we do get rid of the sales tax.
Mm-hmm. Okay, talk about this, because you've worked on both sides of this particular issue in your position, the numerous positions you have. How is this being received, and how are the kind of sides dividing up right now on these proposals?
Well, it's a new proposal. It's only been with us for about 24 hours now to kind of wade through some significant changes. Gross receipts is not something that Utah has traditionally done. It does have inherently some tax layering in terms of business-to-business transactions. You would tax something all the way along that process instead of what we've traditionally done in Utah with only applying sales tax at the final mm-hmm. transaction point. So working through that, working through a lot of people who would become tax collectors and therefore have to remit is a significant change. And it probably comes with some compliance burdens for businesses that haven't traditionally collected. And with any new proposal, as we've seen with the plans that the Republican side has brought forward, Often you need to spend some time digging through them. The tax bills are not small. They're usually very long, and wading through them with professionals and practitioners is really important to understand all of the intended and unintended consequences of a shift in policy.
Kate, what do you think of progressive income tax?
It's one of those where can you not help whenever you hear a tax program to look at your own income and then decide where you would fall? And so that's definitely the first thing that had crossed my mind when I saw your plan. You know, under the plan, I'm probably one of those unique individuals under the Republican plan where I see a tax increase because I don't have children at home. Under your plan, I'm likely also still seeing a little bit more than I would currently. But you know, it's an idea I would actually like to talk about more. The question, I guess, is whether we'll get to talk about it and whether we have enough time to talk about it before the session starts or a special session comes around.
Let's talk about it for a second, Bryan, because that has become the heart of some concern, is that it's maybe happening in a special session this next week. What are you hearing about that issue? Is there enough time for people to digest even this plan that came out this week and for this special session?
Well, they're going to have another tax reform task force meeting on Monday. They, I think, have the meat of what they want to bring to a special session done, but they're just trying to chip away around the edges and you know, try to get a few more votes on board. Talking with a number of lawmakers, they're getting pressure from their voters who don't understand the need for this. Lawmakers are telling me leadership, Republican leadership, has not done a good job selling this idea, why we need to do it, and why we need to do it now. Why can't they wait for the special session? They don't like the ideas that are being put forward to change funding for education. So there's a lot of moving parts out there, and legislative leadership at least has not done a good job of convincing the public of the need to do this. Will they have the votes to do this? Yeah, if it comes down to it. But there's going to be a lot of lawmakers, Republicans in swing seats, who are going to have a really tough vote.
Let me show a tweet from a governor candidate, Amy Winder-Newton, Councilwoman, because I think it's interesting getting to what Bryan Schott was just saying. Amy Winder-Newton tweeted, "Hey, state legislators," I guess that's who you also represent, "can we please save tax reform for the legislative session in Jan? It seems a special session during the holidays when people aren't paying attention is a bad idea. Something as important as this deserves robust public comment and debate." Yeah, Bryan.
Perception is reality in politics. So it seems like they're rushing into this. But if you look at it, they've been talking to this since the beginning of the session last year, and then they had a number of meetings around the state, and they've had tax reform meetings. So they've been talking about this for the good part of a year. So that's a little bit of a bad faith argument, I think, made by Congress, by Councilwoman Winder-Newton. It's a little bit of a bad faith argument because they've been talking about this for a long time. But in politics, perception is reality. So everyone's like, why are you rushing? Well, yeah, so if people think you're rushing, then you probably are.
One of the things I think is interesting to this point for you, Representative, is a comment from you this week. People are wondering, do the Democrats feel like we need to do something? And you said yes. So kind of identify that issue a little bit, because you're not saying leave it all alone.
No, we're not. We think that it needs to be revisited, and we need to make some adjustments in our budget structure right now. But I do agree that it's not necessary to do it in a special session. I think that our tax proposal was presented as something, as an alternative to what the Republicans are speaking about, because we want people in the state of Utah to know Democrats don't have ideas here. I mean, we do have ideas, good ones, and we want to talk about them. But the last time we did tax reform was in 2008, and we had a lead-up period of over 2 years where we were talking about it in detail, and that was primarily just the income tax. We are handling a much bigger picture now. We're trying to do a lot more in terms of basic restructuring with many moving parts. I do think that it would be beneficial for the people of the state of Utah and for us as a legislature if we slowed things down and took a longer look at this. It doesn't have to be done in special session. It doesn't even have to be done in the 2020 general session. Our proposal is not ready for prime time in terms of being presented as an alternative bill in the special session. It's some ideas about how we can move forward in a better way for the people of the state of Utah, but we need to have more input.
You know, one of the things that's interesting is the proposal that the Republicans have put forward. I always think it was kind of like Part A. It involves sales tax, it involves some income tax cuts. But there's this Part B that's still out there, floating out there, that deals with the education earmark for public education. And that is still largely a bullet point plan. It's not yet in bill form, but there's so much tied together. And we haven't fully seen that. And to not really see that in advance of the hearing next week and then a potential special session at the end of next week is a little bit troubling, that these are tied, yet we can only see one part so far in bill form.
So explain what the plan is, what you're hearing in those back rooms, because what Kay just said is true, right? This constitutional earmark has been in effect since 1946?
Yeah, or even earlier, I think.
So for a very long time, we've had this where it's been earmarked for public ed. Maybe, Bryan, take a second on that, because that seems to be at the heart of it, and tell me if I'm wrong, Representative. The Democrats are not proposing to get rid of that.
That's correct. We are not proposing to get rid of the earmark.
Yeah, so the easiest way to explain it, because the way that they do the budget here in the state is very complicated. There are two pots of money. One pot is all the income tax, business and personal, that goes in and then has to go to education. The other pot is all the other money that comes in and that pays for everything else. And lawmakers want to get rid of the constitutional earmark so that they have one pot of money, and that will give them a lot more flexibility in the way that they do the budget, but that will require constitutional amendment. They are trying to come up with a way to fund schools without that constitutional requirement. So what we've been reporting on for a little more than a month is that they're looking at a way to allow local entities to increase property taxes without having to go through a truth in taxation hearing, because that's a very cumbersome process and it's hard to get through. So they may tie property taxes to change CPI, the economy, which will allow it to increase modestly with inflation. There will be some breakers in there to keep it from going too high. At the same time, on the state level, they want to guarantee the funding of the growth in schools every year, and they also want to take the basic unit of student funding, which is the WPU, and tie that to the change CPI as well. I'm not sure that they're going to be able to get anybody on board with that. This is definitely not going to be ready for the special session at all.
I want to break. Do you have something on that first?
Well, I was just going to say that's part of this interesting issue, is that the Republicans in the legislature has very much tried to shift this argument to being about a structural imbalance and having all the money in one pot so that they can do the important job of weighing all the needs of the state and divvying out the money. But if we don't solve the education piece, we actually truly haven't solved the structural imbalance, and it feels like the bill that's being put forward then is still not quite ready.
So I want to talk about that education side, because the response from the Utah Education Association was pretty quick. Representative, I want to read that, because President Heidi Matthews immediately, this is to Kate's point right here, said the overall tax proposal plus the education piece cuts hundreds of millions of dollars from our schools. That's not good for kids. It's wrong for our teachers. It's wrong for our schools. It's wrong for our students, and it's wrong for Utah.
Heidi Matthews is right. I mean, we're 51st in the country. And what we're seeing proposed by our Republican leadership is we want to cut the revenue for public and higher education even further. I just don't understand how that makes any sense. And I don't think it lines up with the values and priorities of Utahns.
Well, how does the legislature right now think, let's say if that proposal starts going forward, they'll handle that bridge? Because the Utahns have to vote on that change. What is the parallel track that you're seeing now?
I think that's the problem. And it goes to what Kate was saying, which is we're trying to put in place next week in a special session a budget that assumes one of two things: either that we will pass something next November that deals with the constitutional earmark and removes it, or that voters won't approve that. We just don't know what the answer is. So you can't, I don't think that we should be going ahead with making decisions about budgetary changes without knowing the complete picture.
One more thing on this, Kate, not many people know this, but since you love higher ed so much, higher ed is also tied to that constitutional earmark. Potential impacts for...
It's definitely true. I mean, we focused a lot in the discussions this summer on public education, but higher education is tied. You were also part of that restricted pool of money for income tax. So what happens with this earmark is important to all of the higher ed institutions as well, and whether that funding will be replaced, how these different property tax proposals will impact you, because higher ed is not able to draw those local district funds like a public school is. And so there's still a lot of moving parts, I think, in there, and I don't know that higher ed exactly knows where they will ultimately come out at this point. What
I think is interesting here, too, is based on some great reporting you're doing, Bryan, is oftentimes you try to do a tax cut right before an election. It's helpful if you can do that. But our legislators right now are not in the position where that's uniformly true if they are successful. Is that right?
Well, some of the things that people are talking to me about is they're saying that it feels like the tax cut is driving this overall discussion. They've been talking about it has to have a tax cut, and that makes sense because we are running these huge, they're huge but large budget surpluses every year, but that's because it's in the income tax, which goes to education. The sales tax portion of it is lagging behind, so that's why lawmakers want to do this. But they're and they know that they're going to have another large income tax surplus next year. It's going to be over $100 million again. So they want to give some of that back. But it just seems like they're not quite able to put their finger on what they want to do, and they're not really able to explain why they need to do this. And that's where it's falling apart for them. They're not able to explain to voters, and legislators are hearing it from their voters. We don't know why you want to do this now. It doesn't make any sense.
One more point before we leave it, Kate. So as a councilwoman, you're involved in property tax issues at a very local level. Tell us just really quickly what this proposal, the Republican proposal right now, does on property tax issues and how that impacts education also.
The proposal, as it's currently understood, would be to replace the earmark for public education with the ability for property tax for local school districts to be tied to chain CPI, probably about 2%. And they could have that just automatically rise without going through a truth in taxation hearing. Truth in taxation was a policy put in place in 1985. It requires this hearing, and they are painful hearings. My city this year, we thought about doing a truth in taxation hearing, immediately heard from people, decided we were comfortable with the revenue we had, decided not to. It was a deterrent before we even got to a hearing. And so that has been something that local governments, local school boards have said, this is why, legislature, we have not raised property taxes, because you have made it very hard for us. If this proposal were to go forward and allow for this chain CPI for local school districts to take place, one, it likely would evaporate the tax cuts within a few years, where you'd be back up to a total tax picture that doesn't feel like a cut for anyone. But you'd also have to wonder, quite frankly, I think as a local government official, I could make the case that public safety is equally important, and perhaps we should be able to also rise with inflation for that very critical government service as well.
Okay, interesting. One last thing, Representative, the Democrats plan on the sales tax on food and hygiene products, two things also that differ from what the Republicans are proposing.
Well, if we get rid of the sales tax completely, there'll be no sales tax on either food or hygiene, and that will be a good thing. There are a couple of components in the Republican presentation that we like. One is we like the fact that there are going to be no sales taxes on feminine hygiene products. That's a good thing. We think that there ought to be no sales tax on food either, and they're moving in the opposite wrong direction on that point, in sense of taking our sales tax of 1.75% and moving it up to 4.65%. Or maybe it's 8.5% for food. And that's going to make it more difficult for the people who are really struggling to literally put food on their table. So there are things that we like. We like the fact that there's an earned income tax credit component to the Republican plan. So it's not all bad. And I think that they have tried to put some things in there to make it attractive for Democrats and try and peel away some Democratic votes. I don't know that that's going to happen, but they'd love to have this be a bipartisan proposal if we have a special session and they pass something next week.
Okay. The opinion of the panel, special session does happen next week?
Yeah, I think so.
Brian's a yes?
Probably. Probably.
We're going to get a probably. Okay.
I think I'm going to probably too. I question about whether they need to certify to the governor they can deliver 1538.
We haven't gotten the call yet, and here we are, the last day of the week. We have to wait until Monday to get the call at this point.
Hopefully it comes after the U of U football game. We'll get the call about that. Let's switch gears a little bit to what's happening in Washington, D.C., because our own delegation is weighing in on the impeachment proceedings. Bryan, most recent developments. Nancy Pelosi's had a victories?
I think the day that Ben McAdams has been dreading is coming. Nancy Pelosi directed the Democrat, the chairman of the committees, to come up to draft articles of impeachment against the president. This is a vote that Ben McAdams has not wanted to take, because I think he's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't. If he votes in favor of impeachment, members of his base are going to be outraged. His district does not like President Trump. President Trump only got 39% of the vote there in 2016. He's underwater, according to our polling. In fact, that's probably where his approval ratings are the lowest in the state. If he does vote in favor, if he does vote against impeachment, then the Republicans are going to continue to carpet bomb him all the way to the 2020 election. So he's really, I think he's been hoping he wouldn't have to take this vote, but he's going to have to.
Where is he on this? Give us the
I'll
analysis.
tell you, I think it is a tough vote for Ben, but I think he's going to, in all likelihood, be persuaded by the weight of evidence that clearly shows that there was an impermissible use of taxpayer money in an attempt to obtain help for the personal benefit of Donald Trump in this next campaign in 2020. And that's a problem. I mean, the stuff that he has admitted to doing, I think, makes it clear that anybody with a conscience in the House is going to have to vote for impeachment, because it's a clear violation of law. Now, I heard Senator Lee's comments about this, and I guess we'll just have to agree to disagree about whether there's clear evidence of wrongdoing.
Maybe we should hear those. Why don't I read those to you, because it is interesting, because Mike Lee is definitely on the other side of what you just said right there. Mike Lee, in fact, said, this was on a radio show this week, "This is absurd. They shouldn't pass articles of impeachment because he hasn't done anything impeachable. He hasn't done anything that violates the law. He hasn't even done anything wrong. He just had a conversation that involved a foreign leader, and there was nothing wrong with that."
But in the interest of transparency, he's part of a group of Republican senators who are helping the White House quarterback their response to impeachment, and he's the co-chair of President Trump's re-election campaign in the state. So, of course, he's going to say that. I'm sure that Democrats are going to take advice from a Republican on how to approach this.
Okay, they may not.
You're being sarcastic.
Yes. we understand that's true. Now, Kate, so what's interesting is not many of our other representatives are weighing in at all on this one.
No, I mean, Congressman Stewart has long been a defender of the president from very early days in his campaign and throughout his presidency. But others of our delegation have been a little bit quieter. I think often when someone gets quiet, they don't want to defend. But they're members of the same party, so they're being very careful. Mitt Romney has been one that has publicly said, look, I'll call balls and strikes when I see them. If I see something, I'm going to call it. If I feel like something's within the field of play, even if it's not my favorite thing that he's done, or I wouldn't personally conduct myself that way, then I'll stay quiet. But you're not seeing many of the others rush to the president's defense. You're seeing them be quiet.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that what Kate says is the key thing here is that you can predict where the 4 members of the House of Representatives are going to come down, I think. And Senator Lee has already made clear where he comes down. My question is, are we going to have Senator Romney come out and say pretty much what I think the undisputed facts show, which is this was improper, it was a violation of law, and are we going to get Senator Romney to vote to impeach if the House impeaches and it goes to the Senate? Or are we going to get Senator Romney's vote to convict, rather, on that impeachment charge?
What do you think, Brian? Your sources are top.
Well, I think that Romney, he's in sort of an easier position because he'll never appear on the same ballot with President Trump. He's not up until 2024, and President Trump would not be running for another term at that point. So he's got a lot of leeway there. I wonder if he's going to be the first Republican to vote to remove the president from office. If he does, I'm sure a few others will follow. Will they get to the 20 needed to remove him from office? No, they're not going to do that. But I think it would be a stunning rebuke to the White House if you got 5, 6, 7 Republicans to break ranks with the party and vote to remove him from office. That one would sting a little bit. Romney, will he be the first? He's probably in the best position to be the first one to stand up and do that.
Okay. It's going to have to be the last comment. We'll watch closely. Thank you for your great insights tonight on these very important issues. And thank you for watching the Hinckley Report. The show is also available as a podcast on pbsutah.org/Hinckley Report or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on PBS Utah, we are asking for your donations to support the Hinckley Report and the other programs that you enjoy. Please stay tuned and learn how you can support the programs that you rely on. Thank you for being with us. We'll see you next week.